and welcome to the Bible for Worship at St. Paul Lutheran Church on this Sunday when we celebrate the Festival of All Saints. And our gospel reading is written in the Gospel of John, chapter 11, verses 32 through 44. When Mary came where Jesus was and saw him, she knelt at his feet and said to him, "Lord, if you had been here, my brother would not have died." When Jesus saw her weeping, and the Jews who came with her also weeping, he was greatly disturbed in spirit and deeply moved. He said, "Where have you laid him?" They said to him, "Lord, come and see." Jesus began to weep. So the Jews said, "See how he loved him." But some of them said, "Could not he who opened the eyes of the blind man have kept this man from dying?" Then Jesus, again greatly disturbed, came to the tomb. It was a cave, and a stone was lying against it. Jesus said, "Take away the stone." Martha, the sister of the dead man, said to him, "Lord, already there's a stench because he's been dead 4 days." Jesus said to her, "Did I not tell you that if you believed, you would see the glory of God?" So they took away the stone. And Jesus looked upward and said, "Father, I thank you for having heard me. I knew that you always hear me, but I've said this for the sake of the crowd standing here, so that they may believe that you sent me." When he had said this, he cried out with a loud voice, "Lazarus, come out!" The dead man came out, his hands and feet bound with strips of cloth, and his face wrapped in a cloth. Jesus said to them, "Unbind him and let him go." The Gospel of the Lord. Thanks be to God. This gospel story for All Saints' Day, this Sunday that we celebrate the Festival of All Saints, is a portion of the raising of Lazarus. And this story of the raising of Lazarus is an excellent example of the Gospel of John and its long form of story that it tells. We grow accustomed to the synoptic Gospels, Matthew, Mark, and Luke, so much more often presenting us with parables, with brief snippets, with controversy stories, or stories meant to have a quick punchline. And they're brief, they're a quick little snapshot of Jesus and his teaching or his healing or his controversy with other Jewish leaders. Here in John, we have more often long stories, this one occupying all of the first 44 verses of chapter 11, perhaps even going on, depending on how you read the story, to verse 54, or maybe even the whole 57-verse chapter. And in this kind of long form of a story, the gospel writer has time to build characters, to investigate multiple dynamics, to include a wealth of little details that can tantalize and inform us. We think about the characters just in this snippet of the story that we hear: Mary and Martha and Lazarus and the Jews who are there mourning with Mary and Martha, and Jesus. And in the larger picture of this whole chapter telling the story of Lazarus, there are the disciples, and there come later the chief priests and the Pharisees, and Caiaphas, the high priest, and the whole community that surrounds this story in Judea. When we think about dynamics in this story, we see already here a measure of hesitation, echoing Jesus saying at the outset after he had heard that Lazarus had died, he stayed another 2 days where he was. There's lots of love to go around in this story. The observation that Jesus loved Lazarus, the notion that the sisters and Lazarus loved one another. And there's division as a dynamic within this. The Jews are divided among themselves. Martha and Mary seem in some ways to be divided from Jesus with their challenges to him. So many dynamics. And among the details, the many details in this story, I want to start with one. It's in the very last line of the lesson as we read it. Jesus, seeing Lazarus come out bound and with his face wrapped in cloth, says to the crowd, "Unbind him and let him go." Now, Jamie Clark Solis, a New Testament professor at Perkins School of Theology in Texas, in a book that we're reading right now at St. Paul in the Heart, Soul, Mind class about the Gospel of John, points out how fascinating it is that in this perhaps greatest of Jesus' signs, the raising of a dead man to life, he can't do it alone. At the end of the story, Jesus must turn to the crowd and say, "Unbind him and let him go." Clark Solis identifies that as a signal that faith and the power of faith exists within community. And indeed it does. But I wonder if there's something else in this story, "unbind him and let him go." Because that language of "let him go" is one that John most characteristically uses, not exclusively, but most characteristically uses to talk about Jesus when he goes to the Father. When in the hour of glory, as he is crucified, raised up on the cross to draw all people to himself, this is when Jesus goes to the Father. And it's this very same verb that Jesus says, "Let Lazarus go." Is it possible that Jesus here is thinking that Lazarus understands fully well what it is to be a child of God and to be in that relationship with God that is confident that even at the end of this mortal life, we continue to live in and with God? And so Jesus turns to the crowd and says, "Unbind him, let him go," because perhaps they are the ones who have bound Lazarus in some way. And then I look back through the passage and I see the many ways in which Mary and Martha and the Jews and the crowd seem to focus so much on Lazarus as a dead man and what it means for them. When Jesus comes, Martha challenges him and says, "Lord, if you had been here," our translation says, "my brother would not have died." But indeed, when we read the word order in the Greek and the emphasis it provides, it actually says more like, "Lord, if you had been here, he would not have died on me, my brother. On me. He wouldn't have died on me. This wouldn't have happened to me. How could this happen to me? How could you let this happen to me?" And then Jesus says, "Where did you put him?" And they say, "Come and see." And they lead him to the tomb, and Jesus wept. That shortest of all verses. When you have to memorize a Bible verse, you choose this verse from John because it's the shortest in English of all Bible verses. Our most modern translation now says Jesus began to weep, doubled the length of it from the 2 words it used to be. Jesus wept, and many people read that as compassion that Jesus has. And indeed, the story says that the Jews, seeing how he wept, said how he loved Lazarus. But others said, "Well, couldn't he who made the blind man see have kept this man from dying?" That theme of division. But I wonder, again, when Jesus has asked, "Where have you put him?" wouldn't the appropriate response be, "We have committed him to God's care"? We have confidently given him to the Father who has promised to raise him up at the last day. And yet what they say is, come to the tomb, come and see. And so when Jesus sees where they put him, he weeps. Perhaps out of love for Lazarus, perhaps just as much out of disappointment at their focus on the body and on death and on the tomb. He is moved at their sorrow and their sense of loss, and also perhaps at their denseness about all of this. Could it be that the Jews who say, see how he loved him, are just as mistaken as the Jews who think he should have kept him from dying? The point is not that Jesus will keep us from dying our natural death. It is that there is another life already at work within us, which will transcend death. And when Lazarus comes out, still bound, strips of cloth on his hands and feet wrapped around his head, and Jesus turns to them and says, unbind him and let him go. Lazarus, who is prepared, we think, to go to the Father, faithful believer, faithful Jew that he was, confident about the love of God for him and God's ultimate redemption in the kingdom. But here he was, bound in strips of cloth, laid in a grave, and the community around him is still focused on his body, his mortality, his death. And Jesus says, you unbind him. You let him go where his destiny awaits him in the kingdom. On this festival of All Saints, this festival when we remember those in our own lives whom we have lost, but God has not, who have died the mortal death that we all face, but who live alive to Christ. How powerful is this message and this implicit promise, this word of confident faith that Jesus offers us, telling us that we can unbind them and let them go because God holds them, always has, because Christ was raised up and drew all people to himself, because he says, even though they die, yet they will live. We need not focus on their graves. We can unbind them and let them go. God bless.